A young woman in a small Missouri town picked up a payphone late on a Thursday night to call her fiancé. They'd been talking for a few minutes when she mentioned a strange truck circling the parking lot, and the driver got out and walked toward her with a flashlight. Just then, she screamed into the receiver, and her fiancé jumped into his car and raced toward her location. He'd get close enough to see the truck's taillights before everything went completely wrong. That was in 1991, and nobody has seen Angela Hammond since. Clinton, Missouri sits about 70 miles southeast of Kansas City in Henry County. In 1991, the population hovered around 8 or 9,000, and it was still small enough that people knew each other and knew each other's vehicles. The town had one main square, a handful of stores, and a slow rhythm that didn't lend itself to high-profile criminal cases. Angela Hammond had grown up nearby. She'd recently graduated from Montrose High School, a tiny rural school just outside Clinton, and was 20 years old in the spring of 1991. She was engaged to a man named Rob Schaefer, and the couple was 4 months pregnant, and by all accounts, excited about their new family. The evening of Thursday, April 4th, 1991, had been an ordinary one. Angela had spent part of the day with Rob and dropped him off at his parents' house earlier so he could watch his younger brother. Around 11:15 that night, she stopped at a payphone at the corner of 2nd and Jefferson Streets, near a local food barn store. She wanted to call Rob and let him know she was heading home for the night. This was 1991, so a late-night stop at a payphone for a quick check-in was something young couples did all the time without thinking twice about it. Rob picked up, and they talked easily for a while before Angela mentioned the truck. But when she did, she said that it was an older green pickup that had been doing slow loops through the lot. She described the driver as a white male in coveralls and a dark baseball cap, with glasses, a beard, and a mustache. According to Rob's account, she wasn't panicked at first, but she sounded uncomfortable with what exactly he was doing. The man eventually got out of his vehicle and started walking toward her with a flashlight, and it first appeared as if he were searching for something he'd dropped, but then he kept coming. What happened next, by Rob's own account given to investigators and later to interviewers over the years, was the kind of thing a person doesn't move past. The line picked up the sounds of a struggle. Angela screamed, and then the receiver came loose, and then everything just faded to nothing in an instant. Rob got in his car and pushed it as fast as it would go across town. As he closed in on the lot, an older green pickup blew past him going the other direction. He recognized it instantly from Angela's description, and he whipped his car around and chased the truck down a back road. He was getting close enough to be reasonably certain what he was looking at, including what he believed was a second figure inside. Then his transmission gave out, and he coasted to a stop as the pickup pulled away. He was alone on a country road, watching the man who'd just taken his fiancée disappear into the dark. Police arrived at the payphone within minutes of Rob's call for help, and Angela's car was still in the lot. Her belongings were inside. The receiver was hanging off the hook, and as expected, there was no sign of her. Within hours, a full-scale search was underway. The Clinton Police Department, the Henry County Sheriff's Office, and the Missouri State Highway Patrol moved in. Helicopters and dogs were brought in to sweep the surrounding fields and back roads. Reporters from Kansas City and beyond picked up the story within days, raising significant awareness about this disturbing crime. The truck became the centerpiece of the case. Witnesses around Clinton confirmed they'd seen a green pickup circling for hours that evening, and reportedly earlier in the day as well. The vehicle eventually got a more specific description: an older Ford pickup, likely from the 1970s and painted green. Witnesses also said there was a picture of a fish painted on the back window. And keep this in mind, because I think this detail is more significant than it's been made out to be. The Missouri State Highway Patrol reportedly examined hundreds of trucks across the state that fit the description, and none of them produced a match. The driver's description was also largely consistent, with most describing a white man in coveralls, a dark baseball cap, glasses, and facial hair. Most of the witnesses also emphasized that the man looked incredibly dirty, as if he had been doing hard physical labor all day and had skipped out on the requisite shower. However, some accounts suggest the man was clean-shaven, and the only forensic sketch I've been able to find for the case shows him without a beard. Notably, despite this being a small town where everyone seems to know everyone, no one recognized this mysterious man. Rob, for his part, was initially treated with significant suspicion by the police given the almost cinematic telling of what happened to Angela. He was given a polygraph within days, which he passed, and investigators cleared him within roughly a week. By fall, when Angela's baby would have been born, the investigation was effectively cold. For more than 3 decades, the case has been picked through repeatedly, and several theories have surfaced over the years. The most striking new development came in 2021, on the 30th anniversary of Angela's disappearance. A confidential informant, someone who'd helped law enforcement years earlier with a narcotics operation, received an anonymous letter. The letter was a cut-and-paste affair, the kind put together from clipped pieces of newsprint, the kind of things that serial predators send to the cops. What made it remarkable was the contents. It correctly listed the informant's court-issued cooperation number, named his estranged wife, and had been postmarked April 4th, 1991, the same day Angela was taken, then mailed decades later. Investigators have publicly said the letter has reshaped how they're thinking about the case. The informant, it turned out, had a daughter named Angela, who was living in Clinton at the time. To make matters more bizarre, she and Angela Hammond reportedly looked somewhat alike, though of course given the circumstances that fact can't be independently confirmed. The working theory law enforcement has floated is that Angela Hammond's abduction may have been a case of mistaken identity. Someone tied to a criminal organization may have been sent to Clinton to take the informant's daughter as retaliation, and grab the wrong young woman with the same first name instead. It's a theory, not a conclusion, and there's no public evidence pointing to the people who allegedly sent the letter. There's no confirmed suspect for the abduction itself, and the pickup truck has never been found. The driver, whether he was operating on his own or for someone else, has never been publicly identified. Now here's where I have to come back to the jumping fish decal on the back of the pickup truck that Angela was taken in. I find it somewhat unlikely that someone engaging in an abduction, witness tampering, and even worse, would have been in such a truck. If the theory is accurate, it suggests that the individual who pulled off the abduction was retained specifically for this purpose. It seems somewhat unlikely to me that such a person would be driving around a small town all day while driving an extremely distinctive vehicle with a fish on the back. It's not impossible, of course, but just somewhat less likely than if the vehicle had been completely nondescript. That said, maybe I'm giving far too much credit to what may have been a 2-bit small-town criminal enterprise. Other theories have come and gone over the decades. Some have argued the abduction was opportunistic, with the driver simply hunting that night and Angela being in the wrong place. Others have wondered whether someone had been watching her earlier in the day, since witnesses placed a similar truck in town hours before the phone call. If that was the case, she may have been spotted at some point earlier in the day and then stalked, which would explain the sightings of the vehicle. However, if the suspect was looking for the confidential informant's daughter, this theory may still hold in this scenario as well. The Clinton Police Department has kept the case open, and state and federal investigators have looked at it more than once. The 2021 letter has prompted a fresh round of attention, and law enforcement has reportedly been working through what came in the letter ever since. Whether that effort eventually produces a name remains, like the case itself, an open question. When Shelley Philippoff landed in Victoria on the morning of November 29, 2012, the daughter she'd flown across the country to collect was already gone. The night before, in front of the Fairmont Empress Hotel, two Victoria police officers had spent 45 minutes speaking with a barefoot, visibly distressed 26-year-old. They'd judged her not detainable under British Columbia's mental health law, said goodnight, and walked away. Within minutes of that conversation ending, Emma Philippoff stepped off the curb and has never been seen again. Emma Philippoff was born in 1986 and grew up in Perth, a small community in eastern Ontario in Canada. She had a sister, two parents who'd later speak openly about how much they loved her, and a circle of close friends. After she finished high school, Emma didn't take the well-trodden path of immediate university applications and four-year degrees. She wanted to see things first, and she worked, saved her wages, and started moving. Emma first moved across Canada and then briefly down into the United States. By her early 20s, she'd ended up on Vancouver Island, pulled in by the rainforests, the Pacific coast, and the loose drifting culture that follows people out to the western edge of the country. She held various jobs in cafes, bakeries, B&Bs, and pubs. Employers and co-workers later told reporters she was reliable, gentle with customers, and easy to have in a room. This description would matter given the direction her case would go in and how her personality would change. By 2012, Emma had been quietly settled in Victoria for a few years, working away and enjoying life. Friends and family later told the press her phone calls and letters had been changing in tone over the previous several months. There were long stretches of silence, then bursts of communication that seemed scattered or anxious. She'd begun mentioning a sense of being watched, and she'd talk about strangers she suspected were following her. She mentioned that she felt that random people were pulling her into conversations she didn't want to be part of. Not in any sort of illicit way, just that random people would come up to her and make small talk. To the family back in Ontario, that didn't sound like the Emma they knew and loved, since she was generally upbeat and trusting. Whether she was experiencing the early stages of a mental health crisis, processing some traumatic experience she'd never disclosed, or some combination of the two, no one knew. Whatever the case, as you're about to see, it's very clear that something had gone quite wrong in her life. What's documented in the public record is that, beginning in February of that year, she'd been staying off and on at Sandy Merriman House, a women's shelter in downtown Victoria. The staff there knew her by name, and they'd later describe her as polite and considerate but visibly under strain. They suspected mental illness, but privacy rules kept them from contacting her parents directly, so they reached out to police about her behavior instead. The response that came back was that they should call again if things kept escalating. In the days leading up to her disappearance, Emma had phoned her mother more than once, and each call followed the same painful rhythm. She'd ask if she could come home to Ontario, and then her tone would shift, almost mid-sentence, and she'd ask her mom not to come west to pick her up. On the final call, Shelley pieced together that her daughter had been staying in a women's shelter, and despite Emma's protests, she booked a flight to Victoria for the following morning. She intended to find her, talk to her, and bring her home in person, suspecting that she needed the people closest to her in that moment more than ever. Earlier on November 28, 2012, Emma walked into a 7-Eleven on Government Street in downtown Victoria, and security cameras captured the visit. She bought a burner phone, paying in cash, and a short time later, she returned and bought a $200 prepaid credit card. The phone, by the time it was eventually traced, had never been activated, and the card would later turn up in stranger circumstances still. In the surveillance footage, many have interpreted her behavior as odd, or at the very least, that she looks quite concerned. That said, there's nothing in those few seconds of grainy video that would announce to a viewer who didn't already know that she had only hours left in her documented life. By the early evening, Emma had left Sandy Merriman House for the last time, somewhere around 6 o'clock. Shortly afterwards, she flagged down a taxi and asked the driver to take her to Victoria International Airport. Partway through the trip, however, she got out of the cab, and reports suggest she felt she didn't have enough money for the fare, even though the freshly purchased prepaid card was on her. The driver let her out and continued on, while Emma made her way back into the city core on foot. By around 7 that night, she'd ended up in front of the Fairmont Empress, the imposing turn-of-the-century hotel that anchors Victoria's inner harbor. She was barefoot, and she was, by witness accounts, in obvious emotional distress. An acquaintance recognized her on the sidewalk and called 911, alarmed by her condition. 2 officers from the Victoria Police Department responded within minutes, and this part would unfortunately be a fateful twist in the case. They spoke with her for about 3/4 of an hour, taking down her name and asking the kinds of questions trained officers ask on a mental health-related call. By their professional judgment, despite her being visibly distressed and not wearing shoes, she didn't meet the legal threshold under British Columbia's mental health legislation. While this may sound unusual, she allegedly wasn't an imminent danger to herself or to anyone else, in the way the statute defined those terms, so they had to let her go. This doesn't mean, of course, that she wasn't having a mental health crisis, but that for whatever reason, she wasn't actively considered to be a threat to herself or others. By morning, Shelley was on the ground in Victoria, suitcase in hand, expecting a difficult reunion, but instead she walked into a city full of unanswered questions. Some pieces of Emma's life were quickly accounted for. Her red 1993 Mazda was located in the parking lot of the Chateau Victoria, with nearly all her belongings still inside it. The unactivated cell phone she'd just bought sat dormant there as well. Then, more strangely, her prepaid credit card turned up on the side of a road near the Juan de Fuca Community Center, well to the north of the city. A stranger picked it up and used it to buy a few things, but police were able to trace the transactions. The individual claimed to have no knowledge of Emma whatsoever, and it appears that detectives believed him, though it's unclear how much investigation was done into the matter. The Victoria Police Department initially treated the case as a missing persons file rather than a criminal one, since there was no immediate evidence of foul play. They searched the harbor and the surrounding shoreline, conducted interviews with shelter staff, hotel employees, the cab driver, and various other people. They circulated her image nationally throughout Canada, given that she was known to travel. Volunteer ground searches followed across southern Vancouver Island, and tips began arriving from across Canada and the United States. People initially reported sightings on ferries between Vancouver Island and the mainland, on Vancouver streets, and in remote interior British Columbia, but none were confirmed. 2 unusual events happened after her disappearance that have both investigators and online sleuths intrigued, and I'll start with the more straightforward one first. The first was the account of a man named William, which surfaced years later, and became one of the strangest possible post-disappearance sightings in the case. William came forward in 2018 and said he believed he had seen a woman matching Emma's description on the morning of November 29, 2012. This was the day after she was last confirmed near the Empress Hotel, and the woman, he said, seemed distressed, vulnerable, and out of place. His account placed her in the View Royal area, northwest of downtown Victoria, and it was considered significant enough that a search was later organized in that area. The December 2018 search didn't turn up remains or physical evidence tying Emma to the location. This somewhat unusual lead from the man only known as William matters because it opens a narrow but important possibility. If the sighting was Emma, then the police encounter outside the Empress wasn't necessarily the final moment anyone saw her alive. It would mean she may have survived the night, crossed or been taken across part of the city, and ended up miles from the place where the official timeline goes dark. But the crucial word is if, and it remains unclear if investigators considered William a reliable individual or not. The sighting has never been confirmed, and without video, forensic evidence, or a second witness, it remains a possible lead rather than a proven extension of her movements. Unfortunately, in high-profile cases, there are always situations where people like to insert themselves into the case to feel important. I'm not saying that this is what the William tip was, but it's important to keep in mind. Then there's the man who has come to be known as the green shirt guy, one of the most unsettling, unresolved figures in the entire case. On May 27, 2014, about a year and a half after Emma disappeared, a man walked into a clothing boutique in Gastown, Vancouver, carrying a crumpled missing person poster of Emma. According to Emma's family's website and later public appeals, he was agitated, wearing a green shirt, had tattooed arms, and walked with a pronounced limp. He allegedly claimed Emma wasn't missing, referred to her as his girlfriend, and left before police arrived. Surveillance footage captured him, but despite public attention, he has not been identified. In 2024, the green shirt guy lead received renewed attention when a forensic artist created a new composite based on the old surveillance footage as part of an effort to generate fresh tips. Neither police nor Emma's family have said this man is responsible for Emma's disappearance, and police have stressed that they just want to question him. Personally, I find it a bit odd that this person has never come forward, though there's always the possibility that he was suffering from some sort of mental break, given his behavior. Anyway, there's a million theories out there online on what actually happened to Emma, but they're all extremely speculative. I think the honest answer is that we have no idea, and the evidence as it stands doesn't add up to an answer in any meaningful way. I can only hope that Emma's case continues to attract attention and police resources so that one day her family may have some semblance of closure. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a reminder to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. Also remember to hit that share button and send this video to any of your friends and family members that enjoy true crime content and unsolved mysteries. On the last day of August 2006, an aging Chicago outfit veteran named Anthony Zizzo climbed into his Jeep Grand Cherokee and drove off to keep an appointment. It was with someone he hadn't told his family about, his real family, not his mafia family, and he never came home from that trip. 2 days later, his Jeep turned up in a restaurant parking lot in Melrose Park, locked, undamaged, and entirely empty. He was 71 years old, the suspected underboss of the Chicago outfit, and he vanished in broad daylight without a trace anyone has been willing to share. Anthony Zizzo was born in Chicago's Little Italy in August 1935, the son of an Italian-American family in a city where organized crime was woven into working-class life. He caught on as a truck driver for the outfit, dropped out of high school, and started moving up through the ranks during the 1960s. He went by Little Tony, a name that wasn't intended to be taken ironically since he was about 5'3". By the 1980s and into the early 1990s, he was a senior figure in the Cicero crew, working under Samuel Carlisi and later James Marcello. He oversaw the crew's gambling operations and supervised men who handled loans and bookmaking, making him a major asset to the crew. In 1992, federal prosecutors indicted Zizzo and a number of his associates in a sprawling racketeering case that gutted the Carlisi crew. He pleaded out and went away to federal prison for several years, returning home in the late 1990s to a quieter Chicago underworld, but one in which his reputation was intact. He settled into a house in Westmont and resumed his quiet place inside the outfit, keeping his head down and avoiding the kind of publicity that had buried so many of his peers. By the summer of 2006, federal investigators believed he was the second or third man in the organization. In April 2005, federal prosecutors had unsealed a Chicago indictment that the press would soon be calling family secrets. This was anchored to the cooperation of Nicholas Calabrese, a longtime outfit soldier who had flipped after his own brother helped put him away. Calabrese sat down with the feds and started talking about old, unsolved outfit slayings going back decades. His testimony reached upward into some of the most senior ranks of the criminal organization. Joey Lombardo, a top member of the outfit, was named in the indictment. So were James Marcello, Frank Calabrese Sr., and several other men whose names had been on FBI charts for years. Lombardo, then in his mid-70s, decided to vanish rather than face arrest, and he spent roughly 9 months as a federal fugitive before agents tracked him down in January 2006. With Lombardo headed for trial and several other senior figures awaiting prosecution, the question of who would run things on the street became urgent. Federal investigators believed that role, or something close to it, was being handed to Zizzo. He was old enough to command respect, and he hadn't been swept up in the family secrets dragnet himself. He'd somehow avoided being charged, which made him both useful inside the organization and conspicuous from the outside. The trouble with being elevated in that environment is that it puts a target on your back from 2 directions at once. Federal agents start watching more closely, hoping you'll trip up and make a mistake. The men around you start watching too, looking for any sign you might be tempted to talk. And then, of course, there's the problem that always comes with rising in any organization. Other people may want your spot. On the morning of August 31st, 2006, Zizzo left his home in Westmont and headed out for what investigators have since described as a sit-down meeting. Mob watchers and investigators believe he was going to see Big Mike Sarno, a powerful Cicero Street figure with whom Zizzo had been locked in a slow, grinding feud for months. And Big Mike was also another guy with a nickname that isn't to be taken ironically, since he was and is a true top-tier beef fortress. The dispute, according to information later filed in federal court, came down to money. Specifically, it allegedly concerned who controlled video poker machines and who got the cut from those machines that lined bars and clubs across Cook County. The video poker racket was, by the mid-2000s, one of the most reliable income streams the outfit had. Machines in private clubs, taverns, and back rooms generated steady cash that was guaranteed to pay out in favor of the house. Whoever controlled the routes controlled the flow of that money, and whoever controlled the flow had a real claim on the rest of the organization's resources. A feud over video poker winnings was, in essence, a fight over the bones of the operation. Zizzo's last confirmed transaction was a credit card purchase for gasoline that morning, and after that, the trail goes quiet. His cell phone stopped registering calls, his credit cards were never used again, and he didn't return home that night. His wife, Susan, eventually contacted authorities and reported him missing. 2 days later, on September 2nd, his 2005 Jeep Grand Cherokee was spotted in the parking lot of a Abruzzo's restaurant in Melrose Park, several miles from his home. The vehicle was undamaged and locked, with no sign of a struggle inside, but the keys were missing, his cell phone was missing, and so was Zizzo. The position of the Jeep suggested it had been parked there deliberately by someone who'd had time and was making a statement. In the world of organized crime, a neatly parked empty vehicle reads as a particular sort of message. It tells you that whoever did this had time and confidence, and that they weren't worried about leaving a trail, because nobody who could talk was ever going to talk. The body, by implication, was already somewhere it wouldn't surface. The pattern was old and familiar in Chicago, and federal agents recognized it the moment they pulled into the lot. The investigation that followed was extensive on paper and frustrating in practice. The FBI's Chicago Organized Crime Squad treated the case as a priority immediately, and local agencies in the surrounding suburbs worked alongside federal agents to chase down leads. Investigators interviewed family members and known outfit figures. They dug into phone records and pulled every surveillance video they could find from the restaurant and from intersections along routes between Zizzo's home and Abruzzo's parking lot. What they didn't find is what ended up mattering most to the investigation. There was no usable surveillance footage of his final hours. No witness came forward with anything actionable, and his cell phone went dark after a certain point that morning. Sniffer dogs were brought to known outfit body disposal sites over the months that followed, but none of those searches produced anything. Federal prosecutors made it clear during and after the family secrets trial in 2007 that they believed Zizzo's disappearance was an outfit job. They also made it clear they didn't have the evidence to charge anyone with it. Nicholas Calabrese, the cooperator at the heart of family secrets, didn't have direct knowledge of what happened to Zizzo, as he was already working with the feds when it happened. Whatever took place on the afternoon of August 31st, 2006, took place inside a circle small enough and tight enough that the federal government has never managed to break into it. In 2016, on the 10th anniversary of the disappearance, the FBI publicly offered a $10,000 reward for information leading to a resolution of the case. Now, I'm not going to shock you here, but as of this recording, that reward has gone unclaimed. The family secrets trial itself, when it concluded in the late summer of 2007, ended with convictions for Lombardo, Marcello, and Frank Calabrese Sr. on the racketeering charges. The jury found that several of the named men had been responsible for specific historic outfit slayings, but none of those slayings included Zizzo's. The case against the men in the dock had been built without him in mind, and his disappearance sat in a separate file with its own number and went cold. Several explanations have circulated over the years, some inside the FBI's working theories, and some in the corners of organized crime journalism that follow the Chicago outfit closely. The most commonly cited theory is that someone within the outfit put a hit out on him, potentially over the video poker earnings. However, despite suspicions by the federal authorities, no arrests have ever been made in connection with this theory. Another possibility, raised early but now considered unlikely, is that Zizzo had agreed to cooperate with the federal government and had been placed into protective custody. The reason most observers no longer take this seriously is that there's been no indication in any subsequent prosecution that Zizzo provided information. However, some do still believe that this is a possibility, with the award offered for information into his disappearance being a smokescreen. Notably, everything indicates he loved his wife dearly, and it seems unlikely that he would have made any deal that didn't involve her coming along as well. Decades out from the disappearance, there doesn't seem to be much hope that this case will ever be cracked in any meaningful way. What's left is a parking lot at Abruzzo's, a locked Jeep that nobody ever came back for, and a missing persons file that will likely sit on a cold case shelf forever. On the morning of March 3, 1983, after a series of unanswered phone calls, a neighbor was sent up to check on Peter Ivers at his downtown Los Angeles loft. Inside, the neighbor found him on his bed, half covered, with his head badly battered. Within hours, what should have been a sealed crime scene became something closer to a wake. Friends and acquaintances heard the news, came over, and walked through the rooms before the police could secure anything. Possessions were touched, moved, and taken, and by later accounts, at least one person close to Ivers left the loft, carrying bedding that should have been collected as evidence. The man inside that loft was a Harvard graduate, a musician who worked with David Lynch, and the strangely brilliant ringmaster of America's first punk television show. More than 40 years later, his case is still open, and no one has ever been charged. Peter Ivers was born in 1946 and grew up largely in the Boston suburb of Brookline. His father passed when he was young, and his mother Merle raised him on her own, encouraging the academic and musical streak that came to define his life. By the time he reached Harvard in the mid-60s, he'd already turned himself into a remarkable harmonica player, the kind of musician other musicians stopped to listen to. He studied classical languages, won numerous student honors, and eventually became part of a circle that would seed Hollywood for the next 2 decades. Ivers's college roommates and close friends included people who'd go on to write for National Lampoon, run major studios, produce Animal House, and shape American comedy. But Ivers didn't follow his friends straight into the studio system, and he chased the musical dream instead. Through the 70s, he released a handful of strange and deeply uncommercial albums that earned cult devotion, but not much money. He worked his harmonica into film soundtracks, creating a unique sound that was entirely his, famously working on David Lynch's legendary film Eraserhead. By the early 80s, Ivers was living in Los Angeles, hosting a punk and new wave music show that ran on cable and made him, in certain circles, a minor celebrity. The show was called New Wave Theater, and it did something almost no one else was doing in 1981. It put hardcore punk bands in front of a camera and treated them as serious artists. Peter Ivers introduced them in absurd costumes and delivered half-philosophical, half-street preacher rants straight to camera. He hosted in metallic jumpsuits and patterned jackets, and he spoke in non-sequiturs, and trust me, these are available online, and his performance is truly a sight to behold. He was an Ivy League man playing a part, and the bands he interviewed mostly seemed amused by him, occasionally hostile, sometimes openly confused. He wasn't a peer of theirs, but something stranger and more interesting. A serious experimental musician who actually wanted to know what these new punk bands thought. By the early months of 1983, he had a producer's role on New Wave Theater, projects in development, and an album in the works. There were meetings to take and there was a future to walk toward. He was 36 years old, and from the outside, the next decade of his career looked enormous. The loft Ivers kept on the eastern edge of downtown Los Angeles was basically exactly what you'd expect for an unconventional guy like this. It was in a gritty stretch of warehouse blocks in the Arts District, close to Skid Row, and it functioned as something close to an open house. Musicians crashed there, and acquaintances drifted through at all hours. Homeless people from the surrounding streets were sometimes welcomed inside, and Ivers had a reputation for generosity that bordered on naive. He was known to feed people, hand them cash, and let complete strangers sleep on anything from a couch to an empty space on the floor. When calls to him went unanswered that morning, a neighbor was asked to look into the situation, and the neighbor walked into a scene that didn't immediately make sense. Ivers was on the bed in the upstairs sleeping area, his head badly damaged. According to later investigators, the weapon was almost certainly a hammer, and a wooden-handled one was reportedly found at the loft. In a truly cowardly act, he'd been struck repeatedly while he was likely asleep, given the fact that there was no signs to indicate he took any defensive measures. There was no sign of forced entry, and whoever did this either had a key, was let in earlier, or perhaps just walked through an unlocked door at some point in the night. What happened in the hours after the body was discovered is now the stuff of true crime infamy. Word spread fast through the arts community, and people who knew Ivers came to the loft and walked through it before the police could secure the rooms. Some have admitted in later interviews that they took small items as mementos, partly out of grief and partly out of a fear that things might otherwise be lost to an evidence locker. Bedding, including bedding that almost certainly carried physical evidence, reportedly left the scene with someone close to him. The removal of the bedding is the thing that I perhaps find the most disturbing, since it's hard to think of any innocent reason why anyone would take that or would want it. For a case that desperately needed clean forensics, this whole situation was a disaster from which the investigation never recovered, and some have questioned whether that was intentional. The contaminated scene meant that physical evidence was unreliable from the start. Witnesses giving formal statements had been inside the loft after the body's discovery, sometimes for long stretches. Trace evidence belonged to dozens of people who had no real business being there, and separating the meaningful from the meaningless became almost impossible. The earliest theory, and the one favored by some who knew Ivers personally, was that he'd been attacked by a transient he'd let into the loft. The neighborhood was rough, the door had been unlocked, and due to the handling of the scene, no one could say if a robbery had actually occurred. His habit of taking strangers in had alarmed some of his friends for years, especially considering that there was no apparent vetting process whatsoever. There were people from the surrounding blocks who fit the profile of someone capable of violence over a little bit of cash. None of them, however, was ever pinned to the scene by physical evidence that would hold up in court. A second line of thinking pointed to someone in Ivers's professional or social circle. Investigators looked into business disputes, romantic entanglements, and the volatile underground music scene that surrounded New Wave Theater. There were rumors of conflicts over money, over the show's direction, over a producer or band member he'd crossed, but most of these leads went cold quickly. The musicians who'd appeared on the show were interviewed, as was the production crew. Old friends from Harvard, some flying in from across the country, were interviewed, on the belief that someone may have put out a hit on Ivers. However, nothing held together long enough to take to a grand jury, and in the end, no suspects were formally named, and the case went cold. The fundamental problem with the Ivers case has always been the first hours, and unless someone comes forward, it will clearly never be solved. Investigations rise or fall on what's collected and observed before the scene changes, and almost everything that could go wrong in those opening hours did. The amount of contamination at the scene meant that the potential to actually close out the case was already fairly minimal to begin with. It's entirely possible that one of the people who contaminated the scene in the hours before detectives arrived was actually the perpetrator who came there simply to cause chaos. The idea that someone took the bedding as well also seems to suggest that at least one of the people who showed up wasn't just looking for a memento of their friend. A grown man, a trucker by trade, stands alone and barefoot on a Forest Service road in the high country of central Arizona, holding a $20 bill in one hand and a rock in the other. He's hitting the bill with the rock as if he's trying to spark it into flame, and when the campers stop and ask if he needs help, he tells them calmly that he has to light the grill. Then he throws the rock at their car. 2 years later, in the quiet of late spring, a skull turns up on the rim a quarter mile away, and that's pretty much all anyone has ever really known for sure. Devin Williams was 29 years old in the spring of 1995, a long-haul trucker who lived in the small town of Americus, Kansas, with his wife Mary Lou and their 3 kids. He drove for Flint Hill Transportation, an Emporia-based outfit that ran rigs across most of the western half of the country. By every account from people who knew him, Devin was a steady guy. He didn't have a history of mental illness, and he passed every drug screening his employer ever asked him to take. He liked the job, he liked getting home, and he was good at the long hours that come with hauling freight 1,000 miles at a stretch. Nothing in the record paints him as anything other than a working father trying to put in his miles and clock back in at the kitchen table. On May 23rd of that year, Devin pulled out of Kansas heading west, on a route he'd run plenty of times before. He delivered his load on schedule somewhere in California, then turned around and picked up a refrigerated trailer of lettuce and strawberries bound for Kansas City. On paper, he should have been home by Monday morning, but he never made it. What happened in the 4 or 5 days between that California pickup and the moment 2 campers found him crouched in the dirt is one of the strangest cases in American trucking. The last anyone at the company heard from Devin was a Saturday night call from a payphone in Kingman, Arizona. That was May 27th. From the dispatcher's account, it was a short, frustrated conversation, and he told them he hadn't been able to get any sleep. He said he was going to push on anyway, try to get back on the road, and make his delivery window in Kansas City. Kingman sits right on Interstate 40, which is the obvious route home for a driver coming out of California with cargo bound for the Midwest. From there, the sensible move is to keep rolling east on the interstate, blow past Flagstaff, and eventually hook north toward Kansas. And that's the route he'd driven before. It's the route his bosses expected him to drive too, but it's not the route he drove. Sometime after hanging up that phone, Devin pointed his 10-ton rig south and he left the highway. He drove his rig into country a 48-foot tractor trailer has no business being in, quite literally, since there was absolutely no reason for him to be there. By Memorial Day Sunday, the morning of May 28th, Devin was deep inside the Tonto National Forest, hours off his planned route and miles from any road meant for an 18-wheeler. The Forest Service roads in that part of central Arizona are narrow, gravel, and often built for nothing heavier than a pickup truck. A loaded 48-foot trailer is a hilarious thing to imagine in there, since it so completely defies expectations. But it's also a terrifying thing to encounter in person, which is what kept happening, and through that day, and into the next, campers in the area reported the same surreal sight. There was a massive truck rolling at speed back and forth along the same stretches of dirt, with a driver who didn't seem to register that other people existed. One group of campers later told investigators the rig came at them head-on, fast, and they only just managed to swerve out of the way by going partly off the road. And if you've ever been on any roads like this, you know that I'm not exaggerating when I say these are extremely narrow. Those campers got a good look at the man behind the wheel, and what they saw was strange to say the least. The trucker was staring straight ahead, expressionless, as if he were somewhere else entirely, lost in his own dimension, on some sort of mission through the woods. This went on for the better part of a day with numerous reports flooding in. The truck eventually came to rest in a clearing along Forest Service Road 321 near the Mogollon Rim. When the rig finally stopped, Devin climbed out, took off his shoes, and from there, his behavior somehow got harder to rationally explain. The next morning, on the 29th, 2 campers named Jack and Lynn Yarrington were exploring along that same stretch of road when they came across Devin sitting in the dirt by a tree. He was barefoot and he was talking, but it wasn't to them, and it wasn't to anyone visible. He was holding a $20 bill in one hand and a rock in the other, and he kept striking the bill with the rock as if he were trying to start a fire with it. When the Yarringtons stopped and asked whether he was all right, he answered them in a calm, matter-of-fact way, telling them he needed to light the grill. Then, completely out of character for this mild-mannered trucker, he turned and threw the rock at their car. The Yarringtons did the sensible thing and got out of there, and they drove until they reached a phone to call for help. By the time anyone made it back to that stretch of forest, Devin Williams was gone. The truck was still there, abandoned in the clearing, and his shoes, which appeared to have been his only pair, were also left behind. The man himself had walked off into a few hundred square miles of backcountry wearing no footwear, apparently with no awareness that he was doing it. Search and rescue teams worked the area for days trying to find any track of Devon. Tracking dogs, ground searchers, and the occasional helicopter combed the forest around the abandoned rig, but they turned up nothing. No body was ever recovered, and no footprints led anywhere meaningful enough to follow. And in the blink of an eye, 2 years had passed. During that time, the case sat with Arizona authorities, mostly cold and completely unexplained. Then, on May 2nd of 1997, a pair of hikers working their way along the bottom of the Mogollon Rim spotted a skull. It was found in Gila County, near the intersection of Forest Service Road 321 and Rim Road 300, roughly a quarter of a mile from the spot where Devon had last been seen. Dental records would later confirm it was him, though the rest of his remains were never recovered. The skull alone wasn't enough to give a medical examiner any sense of why he perished. Whatever had happened to the rest of his earthly remains is unknown, though given the area, it's suspected that the local wildlife may have taken the rest of him. Plenty of theories have been kicked around in the decades since, and none of them quite fit. The diabetic angle is one of the more popular, though personally I can't really figure out why, other than the fact all records indicate Devon was quite overweight. A serious blood sugar crash can produce confusion, slurred speech, strange behavior, amongst other problems. The trouble is, there's no record of Devon being diabetic, and an episode that lasts more than a day and ends with a quarter-mile walk off into the woods isn't really how those usually go. Carbon monoxide poisoning gets brought up too, on the theory that an exhaust leak in the cab could have slowly poisoned him as he drove. Carbon monoxide can absolutely scramble cognition and produce bizarre behavior, but again, the duration is the problem. Once a victim is out of the cab and breathing fresh air, they tend to recover, but Devon clearly didn't. There's also the tiny issue of the fact that while the rig was investigated, no evidence publicly released ever indicated any leak. In my view, sleep deprivation is a more honest contender for an explanation here, at least if he didn't meet with foul play, though I'll get to that shortly. He told dispatch on that last call that he hadn't slept, and severe sustained sleep loss can produce what's clinically described as a brief psychotic state. There's also the possibility that Devon was working under some pretty unmanageable deadlines, and that he resorted to what I'll euphemistically call big rig rocket fuel. I've talked to some long-haul truckers about this, old-timers, and they say that taking stimulants was quite common in the 90s when regulations around driving times were looser. That said, we know that he was previously tested for substances and everything came back clean, which appears to make this less likely, but not necessarily. It might be the case that he was on a particularly tight deadline and acquired stimulants at a truck stop or elsewhere. He may have been unfamiliar with dosing and been unable to sleep, or perhaps he kept taking more after he had already started slipping into a delusional framework. There's also the possibility of a sudden mental health crisis with no prior warning, the kind of acute event that can occasionally hit people who've never had a symptom in their lives. However, looking into it, it seems like he was past the age where these first episodes tend to arise, so that makes this slightly less likely. There's also the possibility that Devon met with foul play, and for some reason this appears to have been largely written off by investigators. I was also able to find court records from a workers' compensation tribunal that indicates that the family believes this as well, but couldn't prove it on a balance of probabilities. Given the evidence we have, and making a few inferences based upon it, I don't think this is actually that unlikely. The major data points I'm drawing on for this theory are the encounter with the Yarringtons, as well as, to a lesser extent, his reckless driving on the narrow roads. In terms of the latter point, we know that Devon was clearly acting with reckless disregard for those around him. We also know that when he encountered the Yarringtons, the couple were trying to be helpful, but he threw a rock at their vehicle. That's the sort of act that triggers a fight or flight response, and the couple chose the latter. We also know that the area where he was found has a decent amount of hunters. And the one thing all hunters have in common is that they're armed. If Devon approached a hunter in the backcountry and started acting aggressively, it's a distinct possibility that the hunter may have chosen fight rather than flight and simply cut him down. The hunter may have then fled the scene and never reported what happened to the authorities, fearing prosecution. It's a speculative theory, of course, but it fits the evidence fairly well, given what we know about Devon's actions that day. At present, barring any further evidence being uncovered, such as more remains which can give a clear sense of how he perished, the case has completely stalled out and remains cold. On a gray October afternoon in 1980, a hiker pushing through the brush near the Iowa Hill Road Bridge in California's Sierra foothills noticed something on the ground that didn't belong there. It was bone, and there was a lot of it, and by the time Placer County Sheriff's deputies finished working through the field that day, they'd recovered the skeletal remains of a young woman. Colfax sits along the old Transcontinental Railroad route in Placer County, a former mining town about an hour's drive northeast of Sacramento off Interstate 80. From there, a narrow, twisting two-lane called Iowa Hill Road peels off toward the historic gold camp of the same name. It drops into a deep canyon, crosses the North Fork of the American River, and claws its way back up the other side. According to some sources online, it's one of the more punishing drives in Northern California, full of blind curves and hairpin turns with nothing but air on the downhill side. The bridge that spans the river sits in country that was carved up by hydraulic mining back in the 1850s. The Iowa Hill District once produced enormous quantities of gold, but by 1980 the area was isolated and very quiet. Fewer than 200 people lived in Iowa Hill proper, and some of them still ran their homes off generators well into the 21st century. It's the exact kind of place where someone could get rid of a body and expect it to stay lost for a long time. She was lying in a brush-covered field roughly 4 miles east of Colfax, not far from the bridge. The remains were skeletal, which meant an autopsy could only narrow down so much. The pathologist estimated she'd been deceased at least several months, and quite possibly more than a year, which pushed her likely time of death back into 1979. A cause of death couldn't be determined from what was left of her, but investigators treated the scene as a probable slaying from the start. Trash was scattered around the field, and it wasn't clear whether she'd died at that spot or been dumped there after the fact. A blanket was also recovered near the body, though its link to her was never firmly established. From the skeleton, forensic examiners put together a rough profile of who they believed she was in life. She was white, somewhere between 18 and 27 years old, and stood between 5 feet and 5 feet 5. Her hair was brown, with reddish or blonde tones depending on which description you read. Her feet were strikingly small. The shoes found with her were a size 3.5, which by adult standards is unusual and worth remembering. Dental records were preserved and eventually uploaded to national databases, but no viable genetic profile was ever recovered from what remained. That said, it remains unclear to me if the authorities still have the evidence from her case somewhere in a locker. If they do, modern forensic scientists can perform some absolute wizardry to recover DNA from highly degraded samples, but more on that in a moment. The Jane Doe was also found with her clothing on, which gives some clues to who she was in life. She had on a pair of dark blue Levi's jeans, a small bluish halter top in a multicolored pattern, and blue Adidas tennis shoes with the classic white stripe along the side. None of it was unusual for a young woman in the late 1970s, and it's the kind of outfit you'd throw on for a summer evening or a road trip, or perhaps to go hitchhiking. She wasn't wearing any jewelry, and no purse or bag was found near the body. Nothing that could have identified her was ever recovered, though it remains unclear whether the perpetrator took the most obvious identifying information, such as what could have been in her wallet. Investigators worked the case the way you'd expect them to in 1980, and a number of potential matches have been ruled out. They pulled missing persons reports, compared dental impressions against the paper files available at the time, and chased whatever tips came in from the local area, but none of it went anywhere. Over the years, her case was added to the Doe network and eventually entered into the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, where her case still sits today. Her dental records are on file in those databases, and for now they remain the strongest forensic thread still available to anyone working the case. Detectives have speculated that she may have fallen victim to any number of serial predators who were active in California in the 1970s. However, based on the evidence thus far, and given the sheer number of them active at the time, who that might be remains sheer guesswork at best, and no suspect has been named. So the one thing I haven't been able to find out about this case, and which I hinted at earlier, is what happened to her remains. Usually in cases like this, the doe is eventually buried, though unfortunately, this often happens in an unmarked grave, and record keeping can be shoddy. If her remains are still available, or can be found and made available, the best chance of giving this Jane Doe her name back comes from genetic genealogy. If you're someone who lives in Placer County, the best thing you could do to help the case forward is to call or email and ask for an update on the investigation. Cold cases like this tend to get forgotten when no one is specifically known to be looking for the Jane Doe, and when the case isn't high profile. A simple follow-up email on the investigation by a local could truly be the one thing that pushes this case forward and allows this woman to have her name restored to her. A gray vehicle sits at the edge of a chalk pit in the Surrey countryside, headlights still burning into the December dark. Inside it, a fur coat, a packed suitcase, and an expired driver's license. The driver is gone, and within 48 hours, more than 1,000 police officers and 15,000 volunteers will be combing the woods for her body. The missing woman would one day be the most famous mystery writer in the entire world, and nobody, not even her, will ever explain what really happened next. By the autumn of 1926, Agatha Christie was 36 and hadn't quite hit the extreme heights of her career, but she was by no means obscure. She had finally broken out of the cozy little world of detective fiction and was receiving wider attention as a novelist. From the outside, she looked like a woman in full bloom on the cusp of true greatness, but from the inside, she was crumbling. Her mother had passed in April after a long illness, and Agatha had spent months alone at the family home, Ashfield in Devon, sorting belongings, eating little, sleeping less. Her husband, Colonel Archibald Christie, a decorated aviator who'd settled into a comfortable civilian job, had grown emotionally distant. By the late summer, he'd told her flat out that he'd fallen for a younger woman called Nancy Neal, and that he wanted a divorce. And you're going to want to keep the name Nancy Neal in mind going forward, because it's going to be more significant to the case than you may think. Agatha didn't want a divorce, and for her part, she believed spending time together that fall could fix things, but this simply degenerated into frequent arguments. On Friday, December 3rd, 1926, an argument boiled over at lunchtime, and it was clear the marriage was beyond saving. Archie packed a bag and left for the weekend to be with Nancy at a house party. He didn't tell his wife exactly where he was going, though she had a fair idea. That evening, at around 9:45, Christie told the maid she was going for a drive, got into her Morris Cowley, and drove off into the dark. 3 short letters did appear in the mail over the next day or so, one to Archie, one to his brother Campbell, and one to her secretary Charlotte Fisher. The contents of the first 2 have never been confirmed, because Archie destroyed them almost immediately. The note to Charlotte said something vague about heading to Yorkshire to rest and recover. The next morning, December 4th, a young man named Frederick Dorr spotted an abandoned car at a popular spot called Newlands Corner, near Guildford. The Morris Cowley had rolled forward over the lip of a chalk pit and come to rest halfway down the slope. Its headlights were still on, and inside, neatly arranged across the seats, were the fur coat, a small case with several changes of clothes, and Christie's expired license. What followed was one of the largest search operations in English history up to that point, and the Surrey police pulled in officers from neighboring counties. By the second week, the Daily News was offering a £100 reward, and roughly 15,000 volunteers were combing the area where she had disappeared. Sniffer dogs worked the woodland, and aircraft flew low over the chalk hills. Dredging crews worked a deep stretch of water nearby called the Silent Pool, a place local legend already linked to a drowned medieval girl. The papers, of course, wouldn't let the story go, and speculation swung wildly. Some columnists were sure she'd been done in by Archie. Others were sure she'd ended things herself, and that her body would eventually surface in the Silent Pool. A few dissident voices were already muttering that it was all a hoax to sell books and raise her profile as a mystery author. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, by then deep into spiritualism, reportedly took one of Christie's gloves to a medium named Horace Leaf. He pronounced that she was alive and would be heard from on the following Wednesday. A popular mystery novelist even came to the location to observe the abandoned car, which some criticized as a crass attempt to raise her own profile. The Home Secretary, William Johnson Hicks, was fielding awkward questions in Parliament about why this woman hadn't been found yet. Archie spent most of those 11 days under enormous, mostly unspoken suspicion, since he had a clear motive and a now inconvenient wife who didn't want a divorce. He'd initially lied to the police about exactly where he'd been on the Friday night, only admitting he'd been at a house party once detectives pressed him. Around this time, detectives drained a pond on the grounds near the couple's home looking for a body, which of course sent the media speculation into overdrive. Archie more or less stopped going to work and stayed at home, trying to keep his daughter from understanding what the headlines were saying about her father. The Surrey police found themselves chasing nearly every reported sighting personally and finding nothing. Unfortunately, a number of the tips that came in seemed to be from people who wanted to insert themselves into a high-profile story, proving that human nature doesn't really change. The police superintendent of Surrey, for his part, was very clear that he believed that Christie's body would be found somewhere around the abandoned car. He couldn't accept the possibility that she had simply gone missing, perhaps on her own accord. On the evening of December 14th, 11 days after the abandoned car had been discovered, something finally happened. Members of the resident band at the Swan Hydropathic Hotel in Harrogate, Yorkshire, came to a quiet decision. They'd been watching one of their long-stay guests for several days, and they thought her backstory was a little suspicious. She was a slim, soft-spoken woman in her 30s from Cape Town who'd checked in on December 4th calling herself Mrs. Teresa Neal. She danced in the evenings, did the crossword, played pool in the lounge, and read the newspaper coverage of the missing English novelist with apparent calm. The musicians compared the photograph in the papers with the woman across the room and decided they were the same person. They tipped off the police, who watched the hotel quietly for a day, sent for the family, and waited. On the evening of the 14th, Archie traveled up by train, was shown into the lounge at dinner time and sat behind a newspaper watching his wife come down the stairs. According to staff who saw it, she behaved as though he were a vaguely familiar acquaintance, rather than her husband of nearly 12 years. He said afterwards that she didn't seem to recognize him with any real certainty, though she eventually agreed to come home the following morning. Notably, the surname Christie had chosen for her alias, Neal, was the surname of her husband's mistress. She'd reportedly also placed a small advertisement in the Times, asking any friends or relatives of Teresa Neal to please make contact through a post office box. Nobody answered, because no such person existed, and this bizarre act has never been meaningfully explained, much like many other elements of this unsolved mystery. Christie was examined the following day by 2 doctors, both of whom announced she'd suffered a genuine episode of memory loss brought on by bereavement and prolonged stress. The term floating around in private was a fugue state, a dissociative condition in which a person can travel and function competently for days while having no continuous memory of who they are. Her sister accepted the diagnosis, and Archie publicly accepted it as well, though whether he did in private is unknown. The press, by and large, did not, and the Daily Mail openly suggested it was a publicity stunt. A number of Surrey residents were furious about the cost of the search and wanted Agatha Christie to be forced to reimburse it. After being collected from Harrogate, Christie was taken to her sister's house near Manchester for several weeks of quiet recovery, away from the press. Family accounts suggest she never really recovered a continuous memory of the 11 days at all, only vague, dreamlike fragments. Agatha never publicly discussed those 11 days again, and wouldn't answer any questions about it further. Her own autobiography, finished shortly before her passing in 1976, gives the episode only a few opaque paragraphs, and treats it as a private illness she'd rather not revisit. Her grandson, who eventually inherited her literary estate, has said that even the family considered the matter genuinely unresolved. 4 broad explanations have circled the case ever since, and they don't really fit together neatly. The first is the medical one, a true dissociative fugue triggered by grief over her mother's passing, sheer physical exhaustion, and the shock of being told that her marriage was over. A 2006 study by a British doctor, working from Christie's later writings and the contemporary medical notes, argued strongly for this reading. The second is the calculated publicity theory, which had its heyday in the 1920s tabloids. She was already an extremely successful author at that point, though she wasn't yet one of the most famous writers in human history. In the end, there's no proof whatsoever for this theory, and it appears to have just been rage bait cooked up to push papers. The third is the deliberate revenge theory, that she vanished consciously, choosing the hydropathic hotel and the alias Teresa Neal, specifically to humiliate Archie. Under this theory, this was done to force a public reckoning with his mistress and force papers to publish the name Neal and look into it more. The fourth, advanced occasionally by biographers, is that she had tried to pull the curtains on her life, but failed to do so, and spent the next 11 days in an altered state. There's also numerous fringe theories about what may have happened to her, including that foul play may have been involved, but these are neither popular nor evidence-based. Ultimately, each theory explains some details and crashes hard into others. The fugue diagnosis can't easily account for the alias borrowed from the woman who'd broken up her marriage, since it suggests something more deliberate. The publicity theory can't account for the terror she put her family through, and at any rate, she was already a major writer at the time anyway. The potential blowback of faking a disappearance would have been so massive as to outweigh any supposed benefits that came out of the publicity. The revenge theory can't explain her evidently sincere reluctance to ever speak about it again. She would have had no reason not to reveal everything in her autobiography, which, after all, was only published after she was deceased anyway. Well, perhaps there could have been a reason, since there was the matter of her daughter, who spent 11 days deeply concerned about her mom. The idea that she tried to do it herself perhaps matches with the bizarre circumstances her vehicle was found in, but nothing after really makes sense. I would wonder how a woman in such a state managed to buy a train ticket, check into a hotel, and pass herself off as a charming house guest for nearly 2 weeks. Personally, if I had to choose a theory, I believe the dissociative state makes the most sense. While it seems odd that Christie used the last name Neal, it could be that the name became hyper-fixated in her mind at the time of her disappearance. There's also the theoretical possibility that adopting the name Neal was simply something of a truly bizarre coincidence. Now, to break the fourth wall a bit here, I wrote in my script that it's a common enough name in Britain almost without thinking about it. But as I was recording for this video, I decided to fact-check that, and Neal is actually incredibly rare. At present, based on the numbers I was able to find, there are only a few hundred people with that surname spelled the same way as Archie's girlfriend. In the end, what we do know is that the greatest mystery writer in the English language wrote 66 detective novels in her life. It would turn out that this one brief episode of her life would be, in essence, the 67th, and she would take the secrets of it to her grave. When her two bosses unlocked the office on Manhattan Boulevard just after noon on August 4th, 1981, the radio was still ominously playing. Mail had been pushed through the slot and lay scattered on the carpet. A romance novel sat face down on Cynthia Anderson's desk, open to the only violent passage in the entire book, the scene where the female protagonist is taken against her will. As investigators dug into her case more, they would uncover one of the most disturbing and unusual set of circumstances in Ohio criminal history. Cynthia Anderson was 20 years old that summer, and she'd grown up in Toledo, the only child of doting parents. She had a steady boyfriend, Jeff Lemke, whom she planned to marry, and she also had a tight circle of friends from church and high school. She worked as a legal secretary at a small two-attorney firm on East Manhattan Boulevard, tucked into a strip mall storefront alongside other tenants. Her bosses, James Rabbit and Jay Feldstein, considered her bright, careful, and unfailingly reliable. She also had a plan, and in 2 weeks, Cindy was going to leave the firm and start the next chapter of her life. She'd recently been accepted to a college, and Jeff, her boyfriend, was coming along with her. For almost a year before her last morning at work, though, something had been wrong, and the people closest to her hadn't quite known what to do with it. It started with the dreams. According to interviews her family later gave, Cindy had been having recurring nightmares since the previous year, vivid and consistent. A man would force his way into her home, take her somewhere, and harm her. She told her mother Margaret about them more than once, but Margaret reassured her this was just her anxiety manifesting, and it didn't mean anything more. Cindy had also told friends she sometimes felt watched, especially in the parking lot at the end of the day, although she could never point to anyone in particular watching her. Then the mysterious phone calls began. Cindy worked alone at the front of the law office during the mornings, and the calls came in while she was by herself at her desk. There was heavy breathing on the line, strange messages, and a voice that wouldn't identify itself. The calls disturbed her enough that her bosses noticed, and during the summer of 1981, the firm took 2 precautions that, in hindsight, sound almost prophetic. They told her to keep the front door locked at all times, even during business hours, and they had an emergency buzzer installed at her desk. That buzzer was also wired to alert the businesses next door if she ever needed help fast. There was something else, too, that seemed to be a clear indication that something more was going on here. About 10 months before that final August morning, someone had spray painted a message on a window across the street from the office, on a building that faced Cindy's desk. It read, "I love you, Cindy," by G.W. For half a year, those words stared back at her every time she looked up from her typewriter. Eventually, the building's owners painted over them, but a few weeks later, the same message reappeared in fresh paint, in roughly the same spot. Police never identified who this could be, and Cindy didn't know anyone with those initials. Nobody, then or since, has come forward to claim authorship of either painting, and the second appearance, by all accounts, frightened her more than the first. When it appeared again, it seemed to her that this couldn't just be written off as a weird coincidence. On the morning of Tuesday, August 4th, 1981, Cindy left her parents' house and drove the short distance to Manhattan Boulevard. She arrived at her normal time and went through the small rituals she did every day. She unlocked the front door, turned on the lights and the radio and the air conditioning, and prepared the desks for her two bosses, who'd be coming in later. She sorted the morning's first batch of mail, and at some point she opened her romance novel and read a few pages on her break. Then, somewhere in a window of less than 3 hours, she vanished. Rabbit and Feldstein arrived around midday, expecting their secretary to greet them at the front desk. They found everything just as Cindy had left it, and absolutely nothing as it should have been. The office looked alive. The radio kept playing. A Toledo newspaper sat on the desk. The novel was open on her workspace, face down to the abduction scene, as if she'd looked up from it for a moment and never looked back. There was no sign of any struggle, nothing tipped over, and no furniture out of place. The emergency buzzer which the lawyers had installed hadn't been pressed, and the phone remained in its place, undisturbed, indicating she didn't try to call the cops. Whatever had happened had been quick, and perhaps more importantly, quiet, since no one in the neighboring businesses heard a peep. Cindy's prints were on the door, on the desk, on the romance novel, and whoever else might have been in the office hadn't left the kind of evidence that 1981 forensics could lift. But the door behind them had been locked from the inside, and Cindy had taken her purse and her keys with her, yet her car was still in the lot, the doors locked. Either she'd walked out willingly with someone she trusted enough to leave her car behind, or someone had taken her against her will and then locked the office behind themselves. The Toledo Police Department went to work immediately trying to locate Cindy. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, tracked down former boyfriends, ran the harassing call lead, and interviewed anyone who'd ever made Cindy uncomfortable. They cleared Jeff almost at once, in part because his alibi held, and in part because everyone who knew the couple agreed that the relationship was, by all visible measures, a happy one. They pulled the law firm's case files looking for anybody who might have held a grudge against the attorneys or someone connected to them. Cindy's family, for their part, handed out flyers and made appearances on local television stations, trying to drum up any tips. Then, in early September, about 5 weeks after Cindy vanished, investigators got their strangest lead. A woman called the police anonymously, and she was whispering, tense, plainly quite frightened. She told investigators that Cindy was alive, being held in the basement of a White House. The White House, the caller said, was one of two on the same property, both owned by the same family. She claimed that the parents were out of town and their adult son was holding Cindy hostage. The caller wouldn't say where the property was, and she wouldn't give her name, and just like that, she hung up. Detectives tried to trace the call, but in 1981 there wasn't much they could do with an anonymous tip from a payphone or a private line. They followed up on every plausible White House lead they received afterward and obtained the warrants they could justify. None of them led to Cindy, and the mysterious whispering woman never called back. Over the next 4 decades, several names rose to the top of the suspect list and stayed there. The most enduring belonged to Anthony and Nathaniel Cook, two brothers who together account for 9 confirmed slayings across northwest Ohio in the 70s and early 80s. The Cook brothers were operating in and around Toledo at the time Cindy disappeared, and their pattern of abducting young women fit her case enough to keep investigators interested. Both have denied any involvement, and neither has ever been formally tied to her by physical evidence. The cleanness of Cindy's scene also doesn't quite match the chaos they typically left behind either, which has led some investigators to doubt their involvement. A second theory points in a very different direction. A convicted drug trafficker named Jose Rodriguez and his defense attorney Richard Neller became suspects because Neller had a working relationship with Cindy's law office in 1981. Neller had unfortunately begun to fill more of a Saul Goodman-like role for Rodriguez, something that came as a shock to the local legal community. And just to be clear here, the relationship between Neller and Cindy's firm was entirely above board and professional in nature. However, he rented space in the law office, and of course met his clients there. The thinking, advanced by some in law enforcement, is that Cindy had overheard something she wasn't supposed to, and that what she knew got her taken. At Rodriguez's 1995 trial on unrelated charges, an informant testified that Rodriguez had confessed to the abduction, but the court ruled the testimony unreliable. No charges have ever been filed in connection with her case, and both Rodriguez and Neller maintained that they weren't involved whatsoever. Then there are the smaller, weirder threads: the graffiti, the harassing caller, the dreams that had been gnawing at her for a year before she vanished, and the woman's mysterious call. None of them has ever resolved into anything whatsoever, with some believing these could just be coincidences, or in the case of the woman's call, a sick hoax. Her parents lived the rest of their lives in vain waiting for any word of what happened to Cindy. Her mother passed in 1983, less than 2 years after Cindy vanished, of a cancer that those closest to her believed had been hastened by grief. Her father kept Cindy's bedroom exactly as she'd left it for the next 27 years, holding on to her belongings in case she ever came back through the door. He passed in 2008, alone in the house Cindy had grown up in, and grieving for his missing daughter. My personal theory is that Cynthia Anderson was likely targeted by an unidentified stalker, and that this person may have been someone close enough to lower her guard. The strongest reason is the pattern before she vanished. Cindy had recurring nightmares about being abducted, told friends she felt watched, and received disturbing phone calls while alone at work. She was also frightened by the repeated graffiti facing her office window. That pattern feels less like a random abduction and more like fixation, and I think the locked door detail also matters. There was no sign of a struggle, the emergency buzzer wasn't pressed, and her purse and keys were gone while her locked car remained in the lot. That suggests she may have stepped outside willingly, at least at first, perhaps to meet someone she thought she knew and trusted. If the person was someone from high school, church, or her broader social circle, that could explain how he got her to open the door, despite being afraid. A stranger would probably have triggered panic, and we know she had the alarm there to press if she felt scared. Someone she believed she knew well could have created a brief moment of trust, just long enough to get her outside. She may have even felt comfortable enough to get into a vehicle with him, and if that was the case, it explains why no one saw anything. On the leeward side of Kauai, in the spring of 2000, a man walked up to a stranger working in her own yard, told her his name was John, and said he was homeless. Within minutes, he launched a brutal assault on her, and despite his best efforts, she fought back and survived. Sadly, 2 other women who were attacked in nearly identical fashion in the same 6-month window didn't. More than 2 decades later, his genetic material sits in a Hawaii crime lab, waiting for a match that for some reason hasn't come. Kauai's west side feels remote even by the standards of the Hawaiian Islands. The coastline runs in a long arc from Hanapepe and Waimea, up through Kekaha, and out to Polihal, where the road eventually turns to red dirt and fades into the dunes of the Napali Cliffs. The communities strung along that road are small, working class, and largely native Hawaiian and local Filipino. The tourists tend to be day trippers, heading to the canyon or to the remote beach located in the area. Anyone living there in 2000 would have told you it wasn't the kind of place where strangers blended in for long, which is part of what makes the case so unsettling. In a span of less than 5 months that year, 3 women were attacked along that stretch of coast. They were all middle-aged, white, alone, and stabbed by an attacker who committed the most heinous acts to them before or during the attacks. The west side of Kauai had something it hadn't had before and hasn't had since: a serial offender working a single narrow corridor of the island and apparently working it on foot. The first victim found was Lisa Bissell. She was 38 and lived in Hanapepe. On April 7th, 2000, her body turned up in a ditch off the dirt road that leads out to Polyhale State Park. She'd been subjected to a disturbing form of assault, beaten, and stabbed, and her throat had been cut. And while I don't usually get into that sort of granular detail on the crimes, given that this is a case that I believe can be cracked right now with the right attention on it, it needs to be said. Some of her belongings were later recovered along a road in Waimea. This suggested to investigators that she'd been grabbed there and either driven or made to walk the rest of the way out toward the dunes. The location matters. The road to Polyhale runs through old cane fields and feels, in places, like the end of the road in the literal sense, since there's nothing past it but ocean. Whoever left her there knew the area well enough to know she might not be found quickly. And while the medical examiner's findings were never released in full, the wounds described in court filings and police summaries point to an attack that wasn't impulsive. For a community of a few thousand people, Bissell's slaying was a thunderclap. But because her death didn't immediately fit a known pattern, the Kauai Police Department investigated it as a one-off. That assumption would last about 6 weeks. On May 22nd, a 52-year-old woman was working in her yard in Kekaha, about 10 miles up the coast from where Bissell's body had been found. A man approached her on foot, and he told her his name was John, and that he was homeless. She expected that he was going to ask her for money or food, but instead he attacked her where she stood. What followed is the only first-hand account of this offender's methods that exists, and it's the reason the case has any forward motion at all. He indecently assaulted her, beat her, broke her arm, and stabbed her in the abdomen with such force that the blade snapped off inside her body. She was bleeding out in her own yard, with a knife tip lodged in her, and yet somehow, through some miracle, she survived. She gave investigators a description, a name that was almost certainly an alias, and eventually a composite sketch. He was a man in his 30s or 40s, average build, deeply tanned skin, dark hair, the kind of face that could belong to dozens of men along that coast. Crucially, the fact that she survived, rather than being discovered much later, allowed the cops to collect his DNA. From that day forward, this predator wasn't a theoretical figure. He was a profile in a database, waiting to be caught. The third attack came on August 30th of the same summer. A decomposing body was found at a remote campsite near Pakala Point, a stretch of beach popular with local fishermen and surfers, but not heavily trafficked otherwise. The victim was Darren R. Singer, 43 years old, originally from Maui. She'd been assaulted, stabbed in the throat, and beaten so badly that her face was barely recognizable to the officers who recovered her. By the time Singer was found, she'd been deceased for some time, which made forensic work harder, especially with the forensic science as it existed at the time. But the Kauai investigators had something they didn't have in April. They had the May survivor's offender profile to compare against. When Singer's case was processed, the genetic profile matched. The same man who'd attacked the woman in Kekaha had attacked Singer at Pakala Point, and once that link was established, the Bissell case from April fell into place too. The pattern wasn't a hypothesis anymore. It was 3 brutal attacks all on the same 15-mile stretch of west side coastline, all inside one summer. Hawaii had its first confirmed serial offender of the modern era, working a small slice of one of its smallest inhabited islands, and almost no one outside Kauai ever heard about it. The Kauai Police Department, by most accounts, was severely overwhelmed and underqualified for a case of this magnitude. The department was small, the island was barely populated, and a case of this complexity was unprecedented locally. State investigators were called in and the FBI consulted, and a reward fund set up by a victim's family eventually grew into the tens of thousands of dollars. Officers canvassed campsites, beaches, and rural roads on the west side, knocking on doors and asking about transient men matching the sketch. Some of the residents who were interviewed had their own theories about a man they thought they'd seen, but most of those leads dissolved on closer examination. What they kept hearing was that the west side had a lot of those men drifting about. The sugarcane industry in the region collapsed only a few years earlier, and the corridor between Hanapepe and Polyhale had pockets of homeless camps. A composite sketch, even a good one, wasn't going to be enough, and what they needed was the forensics to match somebody on file or somebody they could swab. Within months, attention turned to a man named Waldorf Wilson, a registered offender with an extremely dark history. He'd been convicted in 1983 of attacking and kidnapping of a woman on Oahu, served his sentence, and been paroled in January of 1999. Roughly a year before the attacks began, he'd moved to Kauai and was living on the west side, in the corridor where all 3 women had been attacked. He allegedly bore a strong resemblance to the composite. He had the right kind of history. And on paper, at least, the cops thought they got their man. And I say allegedly here because I can't find a picture of the man anywhere online to either confirm or deny this. The cops questioned him in September of 2000 and took a DNA sample. The lab compared his profile against the offender profile from the May survivor and the Singer scene. The result, according to the investigation file as it's been reported in subsequent local coverage, came back inconclusive. It wasn't a clear exclusion, but it wasn't a match either. And that single word would do a lot of damage in the years that followed. To investigators, inconclusive meant they couldn't charge him, even if they strongly suspected him. To Wilson, who was publicly named in island media as a prime suspect, it meant his name was permanently attached to 3 of the most notorious attacks in Kauai's history. He sued the police department, the chief, and several news outlets for defamation, but the lawsuits were dismissed, and the dismissals were upheld on appeal. If he committed these horrendous acts, that's an extremely bizarre move, given that starting a civil suit opens up the plaintiff to mandatory cross-examination. Okay, so I'm a bit unclear as to why this case hasn't been cracked just yet, and I suspect that if it was a high-profile case, it would have been closed ages ago. We have all the genetic evidence we could ever need, still secure in an evidence locker somewhere. Meanwhile, genetic testing has advanced at lightning speed in the quarter century since this crime occurred. A sample that wasn't sufficient to yield a conclusive result around the turn of the millennia may now be sufficient to do so. There's also the matter of genetic genealogy, which could potentially identify new suspects that haven't yet been identified or named in the investigation. Personally, I think this case should be bumped up to the absolute highest priority in terms of genetic testing, so that justice can finally be had for the three victims. The fact that it hasn't been is honestly somewhat disturbing, because the predator responsible for these attacks may very well still be alive. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a reminder to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. Also remember to hit that share button and send this video to any of your friends and family members that enjoy true crime content and unsolved mysteries. Also, if you want to take your support to the next level, check out the Patreon or the membership. It was just past 1 in the morning on March 18th, 1990, when two men dressed as Boston police officers walked up to the side entrance of a museum and pressed the night buzzer. They told the young guard inside that they were responding to a disturbance call, and he let them in. 81 minutes later, they walked out into the cold air, carrying 13 pieces of priceless art. These include a Vermeer the world hasn't seen since, 3 Rembrandts, a Manet, a handful of Degas sketches, and a Chinese bronze cup older than the Roman Empire. The frames they cut the canvases out of are still hanging on the walls, empty, exactly as the museum's founder once required her collection to be preserved forever. To this day, it remains the largest unsolved property theft in history. Despite a $10 million reward, decades of FBI work, and tips funneled in from informants across 3 separate mob families, not a single one of those pieces has ever turned back up. Isabella Stewart Gardner was a Bostonian by marriage and a New Yorker by birth, an heiress with a sharp eye and a sharper personality. She spent the late 19th century traveling Europe and acquiring whatever caught her attention: Vermeers, Rembrandts, Botticellis, Titians. By the time she stopped, the collection rivaled some national museums, and when she built her own museum on the Fenway in 1903 to house it all, she did something deeply unusual. She dictated in her will that nothing in the building could ever be moved, sold, lent out, or rearranged. If a single object were changed, the entire collection was to be auctioned off and the proceeds given to Harvard. So when the thieves cut those canvases out of their frames in 1990, those frames legally couldn't be removed or filled with substitutes. The empty spots have been part of the permanent display ever since. Like wounds, the institution isn't allowed to dress. That detail alone reshaped the way this case sits in public memory, since most stolen art simply disappears from view. Here, the absence itself has been preserved as a fixture of the building to stay in accordance with the will of the founder. The two men working the overnight shift on March 17th into March 18th, 1990, were a 23-year-old part-timer named Rick Abath and a younger colleague named Randy Hestond. Abath was a long-haired musician who'd graduated from Berklee College of Music. He pulled night shifts at the museum because they paid the bills and gave him time to play in his band. He had a habit of opening the side door during his rounds to check it was secure, an idiosyncrasy that's going to matter later. Around 20 past 1 in the morning, the front desk's external buzzer rang. The voice on the intercom claimed there'd been a disturbance reported in the courtyard. Abath looked at the security monitor and saw 2 men in Boston Police Department uniforms, one with a bushy mustache, the other clean-shaven, both wearing officer caps pulled low. He buzzed them in, which technically violated standing protocol. The young guards weren't supposed to admit anyone, real cops included, without first contacting their supervisor. Abath admitted later that the 2 men looked legitimate enough that he didn't think twice about it. What happened next moved with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggests these 2 thieves had rehearsed. They told Abath there was a warrant out for him and asked him to step away from the desk, which meant stepping away from the only alarm button. The moment he complied, they told him he was being arrested, walked him to the side, and ordered him to call his partner over the radio. When Heston arrived, both guards were handcuffed, walked into the basement, and bound to pipes more than 100 feet apart, with their eyes, mouths, and hands bound in duct tape. Then the real work began. The two men were inside the building for roughly 81 minutes, moving methodically through the second-floor galleries. In the Dutch room, they cut Rembrandt's only known seascape, a 1633 painting called The Storm on the Sea of Galilee, out of its heavy frame with a box cutter. They did the same to A Lady and Gentleman in Black, a Rembrandt portrait that had been part of the museum since the building opened. They unscrewed Vermeer's The Concert from the wall and took a tiny Rembrandt self-portrait etching about the size of a postage stamp. They also pulled down a landscape that was attributed at the time to Rembrandt and was later reassigned to his student Govert Flinck. In the short gallery, they ignored a row of objects worth millions and instead took 5 Degas sketches off the wall. Bizarrely, in this room, they also took a relatively worthless eagle off the top of a Napoleonic-era flag. Down in the blue room, they took Manet's Chez Tortoni, slipping it out of a frame that turned up later sitting on the security supervisor's chair rather than near where the painting had hung. And, in a detail that's puzzled investigators since the morning of the theft, they took an ancient Chinese gu. This is a ceremonial bronze beaker from the Shang dynasty, more than 3,000 years old, and of relatively modest market value compared to the paintings around it. They left far more valuable pieces nearby untouched, including a Titian widely considered the most precious painting in the building. The selection was strange enough that experts have argued ever since about what this could mean. Some believed the thieves were following a specific list, others that they were artistic illiterates, grabbing what looked easiest, or perhaps some combination of the two. By 2:45, the two men had loaded their haul into a vehicle parked outside and driven off into the dark. Abbott and Heston weren't discovered until the morning shift arrived shortly after 8. When the FBI arrived at the museum hours later, they found a scene that didn't quite hold together. The building's motion detectors had logged the thieves' movements through the galleries in granular detail. But that same printout also showed footsteps in the blue room before the buzzer was ever pressed. Abath had walked through the blue room on his earlier rounds that night. But the timing of his patrol, combined with the fact that the empty Manet frame had been left on the security desk chair rather than at the scene, raised an awkward question. Some detectives questioned whether the Manet painting was already off the wall before the thieves walked in, which wouldn't look good for old Ricky Abbott. Investigators have circled that anomaly for more than 30 years without resolving it. Rick Abath also did something apparently weird the night before. He led an unknown person into the museum and had a brief discussion with him. The feds actually kept this in their back pocket for 25 years, believing that Abath may have had a role in the heist. Funny enough, though, when the tape was released to the public in 2015, it turned out that the quote-unquote unknown man was positively identified as the museum's deputy security director. Abath maintained until his passing in early 2024 that he had nothing to do with the theft, and he passed multiple polygraph examinations, but the suspicion never fully went away. The thieves themselves left almost nothing physical behind, suggesting that these two were real professionals. A few strips of duct tape with hairs stuck to them were collected, but in 1990 the Bureau didn't have the DNA infrastructure to do anything useful with them. By the time the technology had caught up, the evidence had been handled too many times to yield a clean profile. It also appears that there's a good chance that this genetic evidence actually comes from one of the two security guards, in which case it wouldn't be useful regardless. Within weeks of the theft, leads were drying up fast, and the case quickly went cold. In the years that followed, the museum offered a $1 million reward for the safe return of the works. That figure rose to 5 million in 1997 and then to 10 million in 2017, which is where it sits today. The Massachusetts statute of limitations on the original theft ran out in 1995, meaning that the men who actually carried out the heist can no longer be charged for it under state law. Possession of stolen property remains a crime, but the Bureau has long signaled that it's far more interested in getting the art back than in prosecuting whoever's currently holding it. Despite this rather lenient policy to those responsible for the heist, none of that has shaken anything loose. There have been false leads, hoaxes, and ransom demands, including an anonymous letter in 1994 that promised the return of all 13 works in exchange for $2.5 million. The museum was prepared to entertain it, but the writer went silent. There have also been scattered sightings reported over the years, but none of them could be confirmed, and none of the tips has produced a single recovered piece of fine art. In 2013, the FBI publicly announced that it had identified the men who carried out the theft, and that they had been members of a criminal organization based in New England. The Bureau declined to name them, citing the ongoing investigation, but a series of leaks, sentencings, and informant statements over the years has filled in much of the picture. The two leading suspects most often named in connection with the theft are Robert Donati, a Boston associate of the Patriarca crime family. The other was David Houghton, another associate with deep ties to the same underworld. Donati was found in the trunk of his own Cadillac in 1991, having met a violent end widely believed to be tied to either the heist or his broader mob involvement. Houghton passed of natural causes in 1992, so both were gone within 2 years of the theft. Investigators have also focused on Carmelo Merlino, who ran an auto body shop in Dorchester that the Bureau came to see as a hub for trafficking the stolen works. Merlino was caught in a federal sting attempting to rob an armored car depot in 1999 and passed in federal prison in 2005. He reportedly told associates he could deliver the paintings in exchange for leniency, only to fail to produce them when pressed. Robert Gentile, a Connecticut mob figure linked to the Philadelphia faction, was the last surviving person of interest. Federal agents searched his property repeatedly, and they found a list of the stolen artworks with what appeared to be black market valuations scribbled beside them. But they didn't find any of the missing art, and the man himself passed in 2021, denying to the end that he ever had the paintings. This remained the case even when the Bureau offered to drop unrelated weapons charges in exchange for information. The most likely chain of custody, based on what investigators have pieced together, runs from the thieves themselves through Boston area mob connections. It then goes south through a New England associate named Robert Guarente, whose widow told the feds in 2010 that her husband had handed 2 of the paintings off to Gentile in 2003. Another theory, which has now largely been discredited but was once popular, was that Whitey Bulger, the infamous Boston mob boss, was responsible. One of the reasons for this connection was the highly accurate police uniforms worn by the robbers. Let's just say that Bulger had what could euphemistically be described as a pretty close relationship with local law and federal law enforcement. Ultimately, though, the evidence doesn't seem to line up, and at the time of the heist, Bulger's outfit was in a heated rivalry with the Patriarca crime family. Also, as usual, no high-level Boston crime story would be complete without a mention of Bulger's organization and the Patriarca family. Theories about where the works are currently sitting right now range from the plausible to highly speculative. The most grounded view is that they were used as collateral for underworld deals and were never sold openly because they were too famous to fence. Under this theory, they've likely been stashed somewhere, and they're slowly deteriorating from the decades of neglect. A more romantic version has them sitting on the wall of a private collector's secret gallery. This is the so-called Dr. No hypothesis, though most experts consider that scenario more popular in fiction than in life. The grimmest possibility is that the paintings were destroyed by whoever ended up holding them, either because the heat got unbearable or because they didn't understand how to store them. The Vermeer in particular, a panel more than 3 centuries old, wouldn't survive long in a damp basement or a humid storage unit. Investigators speaking to museum staff over the years have generally said they believe at least some of the 13 works still exist somewhere, but no one will say so with confidence. The longer the works stay missing, the more uncertain that increasingly faint hope becomes. A pedestrian on Michigan Avenue looked up on a December morning in 1996 and saw a body hanging 14 stories above the sidewalk. The man wasn't falling. He was suspended by an electrical cord tied to the leg of a desk inside the office above, swinging gently in the wind. He was wearing a bulletproof vest, and in his pockets were brass knuckles, a can of mace, 3 computer disks, and a folded note bearing the name of an Indiana militia group. His name was Eugene Izzy, and he was one of the most promising hard-boiled crime novelists in America. Izzy grew up in Hegewisch, a working-class steel neighborhood tucked into the southeastern corner of Chicago. He served in the Army during the closing years of the Vietnam era, came home, and went to work in the mills, the same mills his father had worked before him. By his late 20s, he was drinking heavily, married to a young woman named Teresa, and trying to write fiction in the few hours each night when he wasn't working. The mills shut down in the early 80s, and Izzy found himself out of work with a family to support, no degree, and not many conventional options. He took that as a sign, and rather than going out to look for steady work, he used his newfound free time to focus on his writing. In 1987, he sold his first novel, a lean Chicago crime story called The Take, and over the 9 years that followed, he produced more than a dozen more. His books were brutal pieces of street fiction populated by hustlers, bookmakers, ex-cons, and dirty cops. Reviewers compared him to Elmore Leonard, though his voice was darker and more autobiographical, drawn from corners of the city he'd actually walked. By the early 90s, his name was showing up on national lists, and by the mid-90s, he had moved his family into an apartment in the South Loop and was living comfortably on his fiction. In the autumn of 1996, Izzy was 42, sober for over a decade, and renting a small office on the 14th floor of 6 North Michigan Avenue. He'd just signed with a new publisher and was deep into what he hoped would be his breakthrough thriller. His routine was steady. He'd leave the apartment around dawn, walk the few blocks to the office, write all morning, and come home in the afternoon to be with his family. On Friday, December 6th, he told Teresa he had to go to the office that night to meet a source, and she later said he sounded uneasy when he left. He didn't come home that night, and he didn't come home the next morning. Around 8 on Saturday morning, people walking down Michigan Avenue noticed something dangling from a window high above the street. At first they thought it was a mannequin or some kind of stunt, but then somebody called the police. The officers who arrived found Izzy suspended outside the building, an electrical cord knotted around his neck, the other end tied to the leg of a heavy desk inside his office. His feet hung about a dozen feet below the windowsill. The office itself was undisturbed. There was no sign of forced entry, the furniture hadn't been overturned, and there was no blood. Izzy had no defensive wounds on his hands either, and the whole scene looked, on first glance, like a man who'd done it to himself, but then things got strange. The cops examined his body and found that Izzy was wearing a bulletproof vest underneath his jacket. He was carrying a pair of brass knuckles, a canister of pepper spray, three 3.5-inch floppy disks, and a folded slip of paper with the name of a militia organization in Indiana. People who knew him said he'd never carried any of those items before that fall, and he'd recently bought the vest. He'd told friends and his agent that he was researching real militia groups for the new book, and that members of one of them had started threatening him by phone. He'd reportedly asked a federal agent he knew socially whether the threats were credible, though it's not clear if they were. Izzy told another writer he believed he was being followed, perhaps by someone from that group. The discs turned out to be the strangest piece of the scene. When investigators examined them, they contained the working draft of the unfinished novel Izzy had been writing for the last several months. The manuscript described a Chicago writer who becomes the target of a militia after publishing a book that exposes their operations. In the draft, the militia tracks him to his downtown office, ambushes him there, and stages his death to look like he hanged himself from a 14th floor window. That was the entire plot. The fictional writer's office was on a high downtown floor. The fictional staging used a cord, and a window opened from inside. Investigators reportedly puzzled over the parallels for weeks, and some read the draft as Izzy telegraphing his own intentions. Others read it as a sketch of what he feared was coming for him, perhaps based upon some of the threats that he had received. But there were other factors as well. Investigators found no second set of footprints, no fingerprints that didn't belong, and no missing files in his office. Nothing showed that anyone else had been in the room, and the Cook County medical examiner ruled that Izzy did this himself. Izzy's family rejected that finding immediately, and they've rejected it every year since. Teresa pointed out that he'd left no note, that he had a fresh contract for a new book, and that he loved his family. In the end, that's where the case stands, technically not unsolved, but with numerous open questions that are difficult to rationally explain.